Dignity of work and the rights of workers. This is one of the ones where you could really summarize this entire talk in the subheading. The economy exists for the human person, not the human person for the economy. Here's the basis of this. You could summarize this entire talk in that simple one sentence. The economy exists for the benefit of the person, not the person for the benefit of the economy. So in other words, no one, a boss, an owner, labor standards, has the right to squeeze out of workers anything that does not have the right to squeeze workers to the point of exhaustion and or death. There's a basic kind of a point there. Now, when we reflect back on this in scripture, as with many things with the human person, we go back to Genesis chapter 1. And here we have to first, the human duty to cultivate the earth. Now, the human duty to cultivate the earth, notice I put that in the positive. And as we'll see a little bit down, in history, rather than the human duty to cultivate the earth, this was sometimes viewed as the human curse of having to work. But the more positive part is really the human duty. This is what God asks us to do, to cultivate the earth, and by extension from that, to work and to labor as to everything that comes from that all the way across the board. Now, at the same time, we all know that some of us have certain workaholism qualities. Some of us kind of overdo it very easily. So right away in chapter 2 of Genesis, this is balanced by the Sabbath. 6 days you work, 1 day you take a day off. And that is, frankly, by divine ordinance. So for those of us who have these kind of workaholic tendencies that really try to always squeeze kind of 6 pounds of sugar into a 5-pound bag, constantly pushing harder and harder on this, we need to counterbalance this with the divine command to take a Sabbath break, to take some time, to relax, and to look upon all that we do and recognize that it is very good. So there's the first part of this. The question, the positive obligation to cultivate the earth and to work, always counterbalanced by the positive good of rest, relaxation, recreation. Secondly, in the New Testament and the Gospels, it is very clear that Jesus is working class. So Jesus comes from the working class. Jesus is not a trust fund baby. Jesus does not have inherited family wealth that he can just relax with. He is the son of a workman. Now, it's interesting also, depending upon how one translates the Greek for the craft that St. Joseph had, one can translate it either as a carpenter, that is someone who was much more skilled and could make things like furniture, as opposed to a woodworker, who basically was like a lumberjack and could just cut slabs of wood and do nothing artistic with it. But either way, one shape or form, he's the son of a blue-collar worker. And that already says something for us in terms of faith. Secondly, his parables condemn useless workers. We just had one, the parable of the talents. The guy who was so terrified, took no risks, buried the gold coin, and did nothing with it. And when he gives the gold coin back to the master says, you could have at least put it in the bank, dolt. I mean, you could have at least done something with this. So useless workers, kind of drones who do nothing and contribute nothing, are actually condemned in Jesus' teaching. And Jesus praises the diligent one, Blessed is that servant whom the master will find diligent and at work upon his return. So work in the Gospels also has this very kind of positive piece to it. Although bluntly speaking, spirituality didn't advert a whole lot to the positive end of work from the Gospels. Honestly speaking, the May 1st Feast of St. Joseph the Worker is a 20th century invention to the liturgical calendar, put on May 1st to counteract communist May 1st Workers' Day, and to Catholicize what was essentially a secular anti-Christian movement with a Christian response to this. Now, as I alluded to, when we look at Christian reflection, theological reflection, very commonly, work was viewed in Christian spirituality as a curse. That is, because Adam and Eve sinned, we have to write term papers and study for exams. So there's nothing redeeming or positive about this. It is simply the curse. You know, equivalent from this point of view to labor pains. All right? Equivalent to this, nothing real redeeming about this, just the curse of what we have to do. And that's a normal current throughout a lot of Christian spirituality, frankly speaking. In the Benedictine tradition summarized Benedictine spirituality as ora et labora, which is to work and to pray. Now that seems to be a nice positive thing until what you really realize is the work part for the Benedictines was essentially a penitential act of what we did because of sin. The Benedictine would much prefer to have spent more hours in the ora part of chanting the opus, the divine office. Instead, 8 hours a day had to do some kind of manual work. And that manual work, in some traditions, was actually kind of hoeing the fields. And in other traditions, it's sitting in the scriptorium, copying vellum and copying texts word by word, hand by hand. Not an easy task in and of itself, but it was considered penitential. It wasn't considered particularly kind of proper or fitting or uplifting. And a lot of this also has to do with a little bit of a bias that comes from the reading of the Martha and the Mary story. The reading of the Martha and the Mary story is Mary is the bustling housewife. No, Martha is the bustling housewife type. And Mary prefers to sit at the feet of the master and contemplate. And Martha says, Lord, why don't you tell her to get up and help me? I'm doing all this by myself. And Jesus' reply is, Martha, Martha, you are worried and anxious about many things. Most of Christian tradition has skipped the worried and anxious part and just simply jumped right to contemplation is better than action. To a certain extent, it is true, because as I pointed out in a daily homily one day this week, eventually in the Beatitudes, when we are in heaven praising the glory and honor of God for all eternity, we're not going to have to cook dinner or wash dishes. So the work part of it is going to fall out. But really, what that gospel account is an injunction against being anxious and worrisome, and thereby sticking your nose in other people's business, telling them what to do. But within the Christian tradition, it somehow slipped into work and labor is kind of secondary. I personally think this has a lot to do with Christianity's kind of wholesale absorption of Greco-Roman culture. Greco-Roman culture, of course, believed that work was low class and gentlemen didn't do work. They just thought lofty thoughts. And we still sense this, of course, when we watch things like Downton Abbey and The Crown, because that same mentality is still precisely there. This season of The Crown, of course, the royal family is looking down upon Margaret Thatcher, who's the daughter of a shopkeeper. It's emblematic. One of the few people in Christian tradition that viewed work as a positive thing is my own founder, St. Francis. In his testament, Francis said, "The Lord gave me the grace to work, and I will continue to work as long as I am able, and God gives me the grace." So working then is a positive thing. It's a grace. It's a gift from God. That's always been kind of a minor key in the tradition, but that will get picked up much more in the 20th century when we look at the kind of contemporary developments, and I'll work my way down. And that's where we are in the contemporary developments. Like in many things in Catholic social teaching, contemporary developments date back to 1891, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum of New Things. Rerum Novarum is a direct response of the Church to the changed conditions of industrialization, mass labor, and mass concentration of labor in urban cities, in which the product of someone's work gets somewhat separated from him. So for example, a craftsman, a cobbler who custom makes a pair of shoes, has the satisfaction at the end of the product of saying, look at this lovely leather pair of shoes that I made. The guy on an assembly line at a car assembly plant in Detroit, who for 8 hours a day does nothing but ratchet in the same widget, frankly, doesn't get a lot of satisfaction out of looking at his end product. But his end product is a nut and a bolt. So all of these factors ask the Church to reply to this changed mentality of work. Again, even a farmer has the satisfaction every harvest of look at the harvest that I brought in. Someone working in an industrial plant, or worse yet today, someone doing data entry in a computer for 8 hours a day, at the end of the day has really nothing to show for it. This is all a product of modern work and the reflection in which it comes in. Now, for a couple of points here, I'm going to summarize contemporary church teaching on work. And it's drawn from the social catechism of the church, where I've got the references. There's a very large section on it. First point to keep in mind, which is a reflection ultimately of the summary point. Work is both objective, that is, the sum of human production, what we might call the gross national product. Work is objective, it has that part of it. There is this entire task that needs to get done. There is this entire whole question of production. But work is also subjective. That is, I did this. I did this. And I did this is a very important piece to keep in mind. I'll share a little story with you. Have you ever seen Michelangelo's Pietà? in St. Peter's Basilica. Michelangelo, that was his first major public work, and no one knew who he was. So when this was unveiled, people in the crowd started attributing it to other artists. And Michelangelo, that night, stuck it to St. Peter's, and there's a little border on Mary's cloak going down this way. And he just went in there with his little chisel and said, Michelangelo fecit. Michelangelo made this. Because again, there is that question of the whole personal, subjective point. And in line with what we've been saying about Catholic teaching, it is the subjective stuff that is the most important. That is, a nation can produce billions of dollars worth of capital, billions of dollars worth of labor. And if the people that did that are dehumanized in the process, there is something deadly wrong with that. The sum of profit can never be the ethical measuring stick for what the human person produces. Because of this subjective precedence, labor is more important than capital. The person that does the work is more important than the profit that is made from that. Now here, honestly speaking, we really do need to ask the question, in our workplaces, how true is that? Especially when we're talking about less skilled labor. When we're talking about what we like to euphemistically call today the service economy, or in COVID times, necessary workers. We need to raise that question. Is labor of more importance than capital? Now, if this is also true, property, which comes from either the direct source of my labor or the collective source of many people's labor around the question of the means of production, private and public property, as well as the entire way in which the economy works, must serve people. To drive the economy to simply produce more and more and more and more and more, simply for the accumulation of wealth, is dehumanizing to the human person. Classic example. In the 1980s, prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, Nicolae Ceausescu, the president of communist Romania, wanted to turn Romania into an economic powerhouse. Much of Romania's wealth had to do with food. Ceausescu organized the economy into an export economy of food, so that the vast majority of the food raised by Romanians went to Western Europe and the United States in order to earn hard currency. The average caloric intake of Romanian workers dropped 30% in order for Ceausescu to make more Deutschmarks and dollars and British pounds by selling the food to other people. That's an inversion of the way things should be. It's an inversion of it. Work is a good. which belongs to all people and must be made available to all who are capable of engaging in it. An economic system that says the economy functions well at 3.5% unemployment, and we will not grow the economy to employ that other 3.5% because that would be an inefficient economy, is an unjust economy. Especially if that 3.5% desires to work. Because work is a good that belongs to everyone. Once again, it is a grace that belongs to everyone. That's said to the opposite end. If that is the case, then one of the responsibilities of the state, one of the responsibilities of the government, or one of the responsibilities of all of the states of the world in general, if we're looking at this in a globalized economy, one of the responsibilities is to provide work for those who desire to work. That's a positive obligation on the part of the state, which goes back to the positive view that we have of work. Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical Laborem Exercens, the exercise of work, for the very first time in Christian theology, gave an immensely positive spiritual view to work, in which he said that whatever we do for the betterment of humankind is an act of co-creating with God. Now, that notion of co-creating with God, up until that time, had only been reserved for the sacrament of marriage and the procreation of children. John Paul says that precise same spiritual good is in work. Now, here, I think many of us need a little bit of work to think about it. When we're doing work that we don't particularly like, we need to remind ourselves that in some way, shape, or form, scrubbing and cleaning toilets for the common good of those who use them is my act of co-creating with God. Ken Reed, administering the finances of a healthcare organization and sitting at your computer all day, and so your fingers are kind of like a little numb from entering all of that stuff in, is precisely your contribution of co-creating with God. Connie, those years you spent in the classroom and those long hours you spent in reading to prepare for it, and those long hours you spent in research in order to publish for the common good, was your way of co-creating with God. Trees, those hours you yak on the phone with our parishioners, is your contribution of co-creating with God. If all of us, frankly, believed that, we would really be much better off, and frankly, we wouldn't resent our work, or from the other end of it, kind of say, well, I'm a university professor, so obviously my work is much more important than Treese's. Okay? Or Treese wouldn't have the thing of saying, well, what am I doing sitting here yakking on the phone? Why don't I do something productive? Because again, we would sense that whatever it is that we have to do is already co-creating with God. That's the whole positive part of this. Now, human rights of workers. Since 1931, the church has been on record to a right to a family wage. Please do not confuse family wage with minimum wage, which is the cheap American connection to it. Family wage is defined as a sufficient enough wage for one worker in a family to provide for his and her family, including food, housing, medical care, pension, and the possibility to take a short and refreshing vacation. You really can't do that for $9.25 an hour flipping burgers at Mickey D's. The church has been, for the last 90 years, talking about a living family wage. Now, there's one piece of this that is very important that flips into American politics. Since a living family wage is a right, and part of that is access to health care. Access to health care is a right in Catholic teaching. It is not a privilege. It is a right. Now, Catholic teaching does not state how that health care should be delivered. So for the most part, in the American context, that health care is delivered via full employment and then supplemental things if that full employment does not work for everyone. In a European context, that is provided by the state as a human right. Just to give you an idea, when I lived in Italy, since I was a resident alien in Italy, I had to pay for Italian nationalized health care. However, my payment for nationalized Italian health care was approximately $400 a year. In the United States, in many cases, it's over $1,000 a month, because we view it more as a privilege. And in other places, it's viewed more, according to Catholic social teaching, as a right. As a right. Now, bluntly speaking, in 1931, the living family wage had a somewhat sexist tint to it, because it was simply understood that the man would do that while the little lady would stay home. Catholic social teaching has been much more positive about the right of women to work, should they choose to work, has been somewhat less happy with economic circumstances that force women to work against their will, simply to get close to the living family wage if 2 wages are required to keep a family going. And certainly, this is part of the living family wage, which protects the exploitation of child workers, which, as we know, in the 19th century was a horrendous social problem. The second right of workers is the right to strike and organize. In 1891, this was a very, very radical position for the church, because generally unions and the right to strike was viewed as being socialist / communist / Marxist. And the church said, no, no, no. Workers who are usually on the lower end of things and do not control the levers of power, or to quote myself from the 11 o'clock homily this morning, workers that are usually out on the periphery and don't have access to the center. Workers have to have the right to organize and strike and defend themselves against unjust practices. That's clear Catholic teaching. Now, the church has not always been, shall we say, the most coherent in this. There are famous photos of the Catholic peace activist Dorothy Day, who in the 1930s, when Catholic ditch diggers or Catholic grave diggers in the Archdiocese of New York went on strike because of unjust labor practices by the Archdiocese, the Archbishop closed the seminary and sent the seminarians out as scads to dig in the cemeteries, and Dorothy Day marched with the grave diggers and personally confronted the Archbishop of New York. We're not always coherent with this. The principles are always there. Last 3 points are the ones that are most probably contemporary. Catholic teaching holds that it is perfectly morally permissible to immigrate in search of work. Catholic teaching also holds that states do have the right to control access into the country, but individual states cannot be hypocritical and then sneak people in to work because it benefits the economy, but obstacle other people from doing that. So Catholic teaching is clear. Immigration for economic or work means is perfectly legitimate and should be encouraged. States, however, do have the right to control the way in which that works as long as it's just. And here, this is part of the conundrum of the American political system, that bluntly speaking, the American economy, especially the American service economy, requires large groups of immigrants who are willing to do the dirty, disgusting work that most of us are not. However, we have all of this rhetoric about protecting the borders. So it's the hypocrisy of that.